Hi everyone, it's Rachel here at Ditch the Diet and welcome to this brand new episode of the Ditch the Diet podcast. So in last week's episode, I spoke to you about my personal journey with vegetarian/veganism and why I had decided to start including some animal produce back into my diet. And if you haven't already listened to that episode, then go ahead and have a listen because it kind of ties into what we're talking about today. And in today's episode, I am welcoming Consultant Dietitian Sophie Medlin back to the podcast. And we wanted to have a bit of a discussion today about the headlines that have been surrounding vegan, vegetarian and plant-based diets over the last few weeks, of which there have been many. I've seen a lot of scaremongering headlines and very heated discussions on social media surrounding plant-based diets, whether they are the way forward for our health or not. Lots of strong opinions out there, but for those of us that are not very clued up on what's the truth, I wanted to get the opinion and expertise of someone who really does know what they are talking about and can give an unbiased and evidence-based answer to all of the questions that I had surrounding the whole argument for and against. So I hope you enjoy this discussion and it gives you some clarity and answers to questions that you might have surrounding vegan and plant-based diets and whether or not they are as healthy as they are made out to be on social media. So enjoy this episode. I'll be back at the end to tell you a bit more about where you can find out more if you would like to. All right, so before we get started on the topic that we're going to speak about today, which is a very topical and interesting one about turning plant-based or vegan/vegetarian for health, I just wanted to welcome back Sophie Medlin to the podcast. Sophie, thank you very much for coming back. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it was a good wee while ago now that we had you on. So for new listeners that have maybe not listened to your previous episodes, could you give us a little introduction as to who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Sophie. I'm a dietitian. I've been a dietitian for a long time. So as with most dietitians, we usually start off working in the NHS. So I did that for about 7 years. I specialised in the management and treatment of complex colorectal, so bowel disorders. And in that space, you learn a lot about nutritional deficiencies because different bits of your bowel absorb different things. And if you have bits cut out, then that has nutritional consequences and consequences on your lifestyle. So moving through there, I started working in academia and I lectured and researched for 5 years, most recently at King's College in London. And now I work as a consultant, so I work for myself. I've done a lot of media work in the sort of plant-based space and lots of writing, lots of radio work and things like that, trying to raise awareness of some of the risks around plant-based diets, whilst also trying to navigate that space where I'm trying to encourage people to be as healthy as they can and to eat in a way that's right for them ethically and socially and morally, but in a way that also mitigates them from getting any sort of nasty deficiencies and things like that.
That's kind of where we were up to a few weeks ago. I was talking on the podcast about my sort of transition to vegetarianism over the past year and a bit, and then talking a little bit in last week's episode about why I had decided to start eating some fish again and then some meat again, and that was because I felt like it was affecting my health negatively. But obviously that's not the case for everyone who eats a vegetarian or vegan diet. So I thought we could maybe start with having a discussion around the plant-based or vegan movement and the pros and cons surrounding going vegetarian or vegan, because I know there's a lot in the media at the moment that says that, there are pretty bold statements being made about it, saying that you'll live longer, you've got lower risk of all these different sort of diseases. But then there's the other side of the argument that says, well, actually a vegan diet is going to cause you to risk you to be taking in insufficient amounts of certain nutrients that are going to give us dementia and brain diseases and risk of strokes, and oh my god. And I was looking at Instagram the other week, I think, when I contacted you about this and said, please, you need to come and tell us what the truth is.
I don't know where to start. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated little world. And as always, my answer is that health lies somewhere in the middle of all of these things and needs to be individual. But just to kind of flesh out the picture a little bit, it's important to remember that there haven't been a lot of really good studies looking at the vegan population in terms of health outcomes and stuff. And one of the reasons for that is because we just haven't had this level of interest in veganism before. When I first was practicing as a dietitian, and probably up until about 3 or 4 years ago, veganism was really a very rare thing that people did. You just didn't come across many vegans. It wasn't something that people talked about. It was sort of very much part of a sort of alternative health community, and it just wasn't in public consciousness in the same way that it is now. And partly for that reason, we just haven't got a lot of research. There is some research on communities like the Seventh-day Adventist communities, who are a religious group who have been vegan for a long time. Those people also don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke, they live very, very different lives from your average Westerner. And often their health stats are compared to average Westerners who maybe eat burgers for lunch and, fish and chips for dinner or whatever else. So actually, when we compare those two population groups, we're not really looking at a very fair data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because it's, when you read data and things, you think, well, is it the vegan diet that's making us healthier, or is it the fact that people who eat a vegan diet are maybe more affluent and maybe exercise more and eat less rubbish? And
yeah, absolutely. And people who follow a vegan diet typically are more health conscious than perhaps your average person, because they're interested in health and they're interested in the sort of motivations to follow a vegan diet are probably very much because of the things that they've looked at and the things that they're interested in, and maybe the people around them. It's very difficult to be a vegan if you rely on a food bank for food, for example. So then we're talking about actually a group of people who are making decisions about their health and are able to because they are from a particular background and socioeconomic group. So yeah, it's an interesting time. So I guess the thing to remember with a lot of the data that you'll see on health outcomes in vegan populations is that some of it's very old and some of it's not very well designed in terms of studies, or very well controlled. We have got some new data, which is maybe bringing the stuff that's coming out now, which is maybe suggesting that things are a little bit more. There are the risks are more noticeable in the population studies that we're getting through now, which is based on some really, really robust data. And I think we can have some confidence that actually there are, the risks that we've always assumed have been there when we think about cutting out food groups, they're sort of being borne out in the literature now. Which is fine, and everyone can still be healthy on a plant-based diet if that's what they choose to do, but it takes a lot more effort for some people. It requires maybe quite heavy levels of supplementation. It certainly requires heavy levels of food fortification, and sometimes when we're actually moving away from sometimes in that situation you're moving away from the motivations that lots of people have to be a vegan. So if your motivation to be a vegan is for environmental reasons, for example, or because you don't want to eat processed food, but you really need to be eating a lot of fortified food, which is technically a form of processing, and you also need to have supplements, which there's heavy processing in that industry, and that's certainly not a very environmentally friendly industry. Then we're sort of straying into some funny water there about whether people are actually getting what they want from it. So yes, it's an interesting time for sure.
Yeah, it definitely is. And from my point of view, even now, still knowing what I know, I have a history of being quite anxious about my own health. So I am quite, the headlines do prey on people who are already quite, I would say, anxious of their own health, and I'm one of those people. So I think that was one of the reasons why I decided to switch to a more vegetarian/plant-based diet, was because of all the media surrounding it being healthier. And for me, I've always suffered from quite poor mental and physical health, not anything life-threatening, just life-limiting, I suppose, things like IBS and anxiety and depression and things like that. And for me, these headlines are really, I read them and think, my my rational brain says, okay, you know that this is just a headline. But then my irrational brain goes, but you could die if you don't go vegan.
Yeah.
So I thought we could maybe like break down a couple of the ones that have been there in the past couple of weeks and sort of discuss the reality of that. So one of the biggest ones recently was that vegan diets risk insufficient intake of a nutrient critical for brain health, and they were saying that it could increase risks of stroke and other brain conditions. Is that true or false, or is it as black and white as that?
As always, somewhere in the middle. So there was two big papers that were released recently in the British Journal of Medicine, so in the BMJ, British Medical Journal. And so when we see papers that are written by big journals like that, who are very well peer reviewed and looked at carefully before they're published, we do need to take them seriously, regardless of what our sort of internal bias might be about what's been published. So the two papers that they looked at there were based on some data, which is population studies, good quality epidemiological data and population studies looking at the impact of vegan diets and stroke risk in one of them. When we think about vegan diets, the nutrients that we know are missing are some of the things that are absolutely crucial for good brain health. So, for example, DHA, which is a subsidiary of omega-3. So it's one of the essential fatty acids that we really can't make very much of in our body. So some people will say you can get enough DHA from eating seeds and nuts and things like that, but actually our body is really poor at converting that form of omega-3 into a usable form for our brain. So you just don't really convert enough. And DHA is like the building blocks for your brain. So your brain is about 25% DHA when it's at its best. And really the only place you can get that from is oily fish or algae supplements. So if you think about the kind of risk to the physical structure of the brain, potentially from cutting out all forms of DHA or usable forms of DHA, then you can understand why there might be an increased stroke risk there. The other thing that is really essential for every cell in your body is, of course, B vitamins, and vitamin B12 is the one that we think of particularly on plant-based diets because it's just not available apart from fortified foods. That is the thing that gives your cells energy and helps your brain to fire and synapses to go across. So we're thinking about two of the really key nutrients for brain health. They're both very limited on a plant-based diet. So it's not really surprising that there is a risk of stroke in that, or increased risk of stroke in that population. Now, I will say the risk was pretty low when we compare it to some of the other risk factors for things like stroke. It's still pretty low, but it's certainly worth bearing in mind. And I would say that most of us these days are pretty keen on health optimization and not just survival. And if you want to use your brain to its full effect, you want to make sure that it's as well nourished as possible. And B vitamins and omega-3s from algae oil, specifically if you're a plant-based person, or from fish oil if not, are the best way, some of the best ways to keep your brain as well nourished as possible.
Mm-hmm. And do you see there being, I suppose there's no real way of saying this is exactly what is going to happen until maybe we're 100 years down the line, and like all the younger generations just now that are going plant-based are, a few years down the line to see what actually happens, because there's no real way of saying this is a definite or not, I suppose. But
no, absolutely. And the thing is, if you think about things like, there's all this genetic risk factors and things like that as well. So if you think about people who smoke, some people might smoke 20 a day and they don't get cancer, and other people might smoke 5 a day and get lung cancer. Like you can't say for sure that something is going to happen to everybody. Same with eating processed meat and things like that. You just can't say for sure. What we can do is sort of think about the things that we know from physiology and the things that we know from that sort of side of science, and then apply that and look at what happens in populations. But it's a tricky area, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm comparing a plant-based diet to smoking, because that's not the case. I'm just trying to use a sort of health statistic that people get and can relate to.
No, I totally understand that. The other one that I wanted to touch on, the other headline was you just briefly mentioned it there, the eating red meat and processed meat. Would you say that is a good idea to reduce that if you're eating a lot of it, or is that headline of eating a lot of red meat and processed meat causes cancer? Is that true?
Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No, that's okay.
Some really good quality data there. So we understand the mechanism behind that, and we understand that when we look at population studies, we can see that that's borne out by people's dietary patterns as well. That said, it's important to remember that there's a difference between having a bit of chorizo when you go out for Spanish food, or having having some bacon occasionally at the weekend or whatever, and eating bacon for breakfast, sausages for lunch, and burgers for dinner. There is a big difference between it. So all these things are in the dose. So having processed meat occasionally won't do you any harm, as long as the rest of your diet is well balanced and you're having lots of vegetables and all these kinds of things that also help to improve your colonic health. So it's all about balance, it's all about dose, and it's all about what you're having them alongside. So whilst I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that eating processed meat is good for you, because that's just not true. That said, it can still form part of a balanced diet if it's had in a balanced way. And I think the other thing with red meat is that, again, from an environmental perspective, very, very poor, but also nutritionally very useful. So there's this balance to be struck there. Having it occasionally, again, is fine. If you were eating steak or burgers for dinner every night, that's a different conversation.
So that's really what I wanted to get across here, was that it's not black and white, i.e., I don't want people like myself in the past. The past 10 years of my life, I've cut out pretty much every food group that there is possible to cut out, I think, at some stage or another. And I see so many people making themselves miserable with food, just, because of these health risks or potential health risks, me being one of them. Like when we spoke a few weeks ago about my health, and I spoke about the fact that I had been vegetarian for almost a year, I did it, there was a few reasons I did it, really. One of them was like animal welfare, and the other one was I really wanted to do whatever I could to help improve my health. But then it really took me speaking to you, and it was really just a really brief conversation and a bit of a penny drop, and think, why am I doing this to myself? So it's not really what I want. I know there are lots of people out there that are vegetarian, vegan for life, but for me, I kept craving things and saying to myself, no, you can't do it. You identify as this sort of vegetarian person now, and I don't want, I want to get it across in this episode that just because one headline says this doesn't mean you need to start cutting this out or doing that, or if you are a vegetarian, starting to eat meat, all of these things. It's just so balance. It comes back to that balance again, doesn't it? Like, there's no black and white. Red meat causes cancer, so you must stop eating red meat altogether.
Sorry, carry on.
The media puts it across that way sometimes. And some of the arguments you see on, like, the plant-based arguments on Instagram are fierce. And it was like, no, absolutely, you cannot eat meat, it causes cancer. Like, they're really quite full on about it.
Yeah, but people have a viewpoint to defend. They're polarized, and they have some people will be trying to sell you plant-based books and trying to sell you their plant-based meal plans, whatever else, and that's kind of, so they have a point to defend. Some of them have got plant-based, the doctors, and they've got plant-based clinics or whatever. They've got something that they're trying to be and identify by, and that's become a big part, an important part of their motivation and their life. We've seen lots of plant-based influencers have to go back to eating meat in the last couple of years. And that's very, very hard and very sad for them, because that's become a big part of their identity. And the vegan community is very passionate, and that comes across as very aggressive if you're on the wrong, if you're not on the right side of them. And I've certainly been on the wrong side of that, on multiple occasions, and it's very hard. I think the important thing to remember is that you need to listen to your body and do what's right for you as an individual. And I think we we do this thing where we identify ourselves by something specific, and actually it's probably the best thing to do is just to understand what your body's asking for. And, you know, a lot of people will be very well on a completely vegan diet as long as they're well supplemented and as long as they're well fortified and they're eating lots of plants, they're eating lots of nuts, and they're eating lots of the good stuff. But lots of people also won't feel very well. Similarly, lots of people would feel much, much better if they cut back significantly on their meat consumption, maybe even to once a week or twice a week. They would feel a lot better and their health would improve dramatically. But while we're really polarised, it's very difficult to get those kind of messages about moderation across.
What reasons have you seen in people that you have worked with or people that you know of that have had to sort of go back to eating meat? Obviously, myself included. I can include myself in this. What main reasons are there for people to perhaps consider including some animal produce back into their diet again?
Yeah, so I'll just disclaimer and say that actually, you know, when I work with clients or patients, it's all completely individual. So it's not that I would ever have someone in my clinic who was, obviously I would highlight any risk factors for nutritional deficiencies and also think about any symptoms they might have that are linked to nutritional deficiencies that are at risk from their diet, whether that's a plant-based diet or any other way of eating. But if someone is absolutely wedded to continuing on a plant-based diet, I would absolutely support them to be able to do that in a way that still brings their health back to full function, I would say. But if someone's open to thinking about reintroducing some animal products and they are suffering health consequences as a result of their plant-based diet, I think there's a good argument to think about whether that's probably the right thing for them. Some of the significant consequences that I've seen. So I'll tell you a story about 2016, so 3 years ago now, I did a TV program. I did the Victoria Derbyshire show, and it was kind of the height of the vegan movement. And there's a guy on there called Tim Sheaf who called himself at the time the Prince of Vegans, and he was, you know, very much a big leader in that plant-based community. And I said on the program that veganism is much more difficult to meet your nutritional requirements on a vegan diet, and I wouldn't recommend it to my patients. The end of that sentence is because they're all suffering from very difficult and complex bowel problems, and I wouldn't want to give them something else to worry about. But it's the way these things are cropped and edited and whatever else. It led to a huge amount of abuse for me from the vegan community. Tim was, you know, very happily supporting all of those comments and the things that people were saying. And fast forward kind of, where are we now? 3 years. Tim's had to unfortunately go back to eating meat because of horrible nutritional deficiencies that he was suffering. So I don't know the ins and outs of the symptoms he was having, but I think brain fog, digestion problems, lack of sleep, all of these things are classic symptoms of deficiencies that we see commonly on plant-based diets. And those are really just the short-term consequences. You know, things like risk of osteoporosis is increased and poor bone density, and you won't see that borne out until people are much, much later in life. But the early signs of nutritional deficiency are things like struggling to concentrate, getting things like headaches and things like that. So struggling to concentrate, struggling to sleep, hair loss, brittle nails, changes to your skin, things like disruption to bowel function. So remembering that vitamin B12 is essential for nervous function, and your bowel is full of nerves that need to be firing all the time in order for it to be functioning properly. So all of these things, you know, when you add them up and you look at them and you're looking at someone in clinic and you can see that they're suffering and they've come to you for help, it's very difficult. You know, obviously those things are linked to diet and deficiencies in the diet. And those things need to be looked at and understood, and discussions need to be had about the safety and efficacy of continuing in that way of eating.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some positives about the plant-based diet. So let's talk about it. I would say for me personally, the last year has been an eye-opener because I really didn't know how to put something together into a plate or a bowl that tasted really good without meat and fish, because I was such a meat and fish person. And so I've learned loads over the last year of, you know, how to create like full meals, like 3-course meals that are totally plant-based. My repertoire of recipes has gone through the roof. I definitely have tried lots of different combinations. I eat a lot more legumes and lentils and beans and all of these things now that I never used to eat. So in that way, it's been really positive for me. But what sort of health benefits can someone expect as a result of becoming vegetarian or vegan?
So there are certainly lower risks of things like heart disease in the vegetarian community. That isn't necessarily borne out in the vegan community. So things like heart disease, lower risk, mainly because you're eating loads more vegetables. So if you're doing a well-balanced plant-based diet, you're going to be eating loads more vegetables, and that's really positive for everybody. Again, things like whole grains, you're probably eating more grains, different grains maybe than you would do before, so you get better variety in that sense. And things like pulses are just so good for us, and so often we don't bother to eat them just because culturally they're kind of not so much on the menu in the UK. So absolutely, there's loads of benefits to being a more planty person and to cutting down on things like meat and dairy. So it's not that you need it all the time, it's just about cutting back a little bit. But it's that, yeah, there are massive benefits in terms of improving your day-to-day health by cutting down, and for some people cutting out is the best way of managing that for them.
Yeah, absolutely. But would you agree in saying that you do not have to be a vegetarian or vegan in order to live a healthy life? And,
yeah, absolutely.
Being at low risk of disease in the future.
Absolutely. So there's lots of things that you can do. So, adopting some of those things, like making sure that you eat loads of fruit and vegetables, will give you the same benefits if you also include a little bit of meat from time to time. Like, if you include a bit of meat in your diet and some fish and eggs and dairy and whatever else, then you'll still benefit from eating loads of fruit and vegetables. So you're not taking away in that sense. In the same way, there are lots of different ways of eating. We are omnivores as humans. We've grown up to be able to eat a varied and balanced diet in lots of different ways and lots of different types of diets. So actually, there's no correct way for everybody to eat, and it's certainly, there are risks associated with plant-based diets that mean that it's more challenging for some people.
Yeah, I think I was just about to ask another question, but you answered it there. A couple of the other questions I wanted to ask you've answered already. One of them was, someone asked me, this is an actual verbatim question from someone, are we actually going to die early if we choose to eat a burger every now and then? Someone asked me that, and I felt terrible because I thought this is one of the things that I used to really enjoy going out for a burger. There's a burger place in Glasgow called Bread Meets Bread. If you ever go to Glasgow, you have to go there. It's the best burgers in the world. And I used to think, I really, really, really want to go for a burger, but it's processed meat, and I should really avoid that. And all of these things. And now I don't live in Glasgow. I live 250 miles away, and I'm like, God damn it! Why does I not go? But that's not the case.
Yeah, no, I think, everything in moderation. If you're asking me, can I eat a burger every day and not suffer health consequences? No, sorry, you can't. But having a burger occasionally, and you're eating lots of plants in between that, and you're doing all the other good stuff, and you're doing some exercise and all these other things, then no, it's not going to significantly impact your health risk of anything. I think one of the really important things to remember about the headlines that we read is that they are targeting what we might call the worried well. So those of us who read them and try to change our behaviour are probably the people who least of all need to change our behaviour. So if you're eating good quality meat from a good quality restaurant occasionally, then your risk is it's a different thing to if you're eating McDonald's every day or any fast food restaurant. So there's a real difference there. But those of us who actually try to change our behaviour as a result of headlines are usually the ones who are already participating in lots and lots of healthful behaviours. We're really trying to refine our health, whereas the people who perhaps really need to take notice don't care about the headlines. It's not something that motivates them. It's not, those people will happily say, there's something different in the newspaper every day, so I'm not going to bother, and they don't know what they're talking about anyway, and they keep changing their minds. And so, ultimately if you're looking after your body, you're exercising, you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're having nuts, and you're having whole grains and all these positive things, and you're happy in your mind and in your body, then you really don't need to worry too much about the nuances of whether having a burger every now and again will cause you a problem.
Couple of questions about headlines and news feeds and social media and things like that. What is the worst piece of news that you've read recently in relation to all of this?
Oh, I think so. Do you know what? I really feel for everybody that it's very hard, because I think that we, one day I find it different. So one of the things that I struggle with particularly with social media nutrition, is that, for example, this paper from the BMJ comes out about choline. Wasn't it? So it's about one of the amino acids and its importance in brain health, and how it could be deficient on a vegan diet. And as soon as it comes out, the plant-based doctors, plant-based community are saying this is nonsense and completely pulling it apart. And people want to believe that because that's already their bias. So their readers and the people who follow them will be saying, okay, good, I don't have to listen to this because this person is saying that's not true. And in all of this, there's a conversation to be had about actually, you need to be open to being proven wrong, or being put, for you, if you want to really serve your community, particularly the plant-based community, the conversations need to be, yeah, there are some risks. Here are the risks. Let's be honest about it. Let's be clear about it. Here's what you can do to look after yourself so that you don't get any of these problems, and so that you can be as well as you can. And it's certainly not isolated to the vegan community in any way. The low carbers are probably twice as bad as the vegan community in terms of skewing science and how angry they can become and things like that. So it's certainly not isolated to the vegan community. But the important thing to remember is that if you are only getting information on your plant-based diet from a plant-based healthcare professional or from a plant-based source, you probably need to think about broadening that out a little bit and listening to information from different places. And, now that we have social media, all news articles are going to be analysed through a skewed lens, because that's what we do. That's what social media is for.
Where's the best place for someone to go to, if they read a headline like that and they do feel worried about whether or not it's true? Is there anywhere that you would suggest that people go to find out, if anyone's really interested in finding out the true argument behind it, or if they're really worried? Are there any governing bodies or particular places you would suggest people go to ask the questions to, or to read the truth?
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately it kind of depends on what sort of article it's been and what it's about, because there's any dietitian could write about that article, but unless they're an expert in brain health, for example, it's very difficult to get accurate information. So the NHS do a good job of analysing headlines, so it's always worth having a look on there and Googling and seeing what the NHS is saying about it. I can't remember what they call that page, but I'll send you a link and then you can pop it up on the podcast. In terms of vegan stuff, the Vegan Society do a generally pretty good job of understanding things, and the British Dietetic Association have food fact sheets, and they're always evidence-based, so it's worth checking some of those things out. But generally look to big governing bodies. People will say, oh, the government and the NHS is funded by meat and dairy, and I've been told I'm funded by the meat and dairy industry before. It's just not true. The NHS is motivated by people being as well as possible, so because it needs to save money, and ultimately B12 treatment is pretty expensive, and that's not what people want people to have. So just be thinking rationally about that and look at big governing bodies that have the best evidence behind them.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. You hear that all the time, don't you, that people are funded by the dairy industry and all these.
I wish they'd give me some money.
Oh, I know. So finishing on a positive note, if there are people listening to the podcast who are vegetarian, and I know there are, or plant-based vegan eaters, or just people that are maybe considering eating a bit less meat and fish and improving the variety of different foods that they eat, what advice would you give to someone with regards to optimizing their diet in this case, negating the risk of them becoming deficient in these things like vitamin B12 and
Yeah, so regularly eating lots of fortified foods is really important. So checking food labels, and particularly if you're moving to things like plant-based milks, there are a couple of companies who are being much more responsible about replacing the nutrients that dairy gives us. So things like iodine is in one of the milks now, and B12 and things like that. We also used to just go, well, as long as they're fortified with calcium, that's fine. And actually, of course, there's so many other valuable nutrients in dairy that are missing in plant-based milks unless they've been responsibly fortified. making sure that you're eating a really good variety of foods every day. So sometimes we get into a bit of all of us, meat eaters as well, fall into a bit of a trap of eating the same things repeatedly. And actually variety is key for making sure, particularly in a plant-based diet, that you're getting all those nutrients on a regular basis and all of those amino acids that you need that you can't convert in your body. I'd absolutely recommend an algae supplement, really important for those essential fatty acids. And B12, I would probably recommend supplementing to everybody as well. But if anyone's taking any regular medications or they have any health problems and they're going plant-based, please check with your doctors before taking any supplements or anything like that, because it's really important that you get that right and we don't tell you advice that isn't appropriate for you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sophie. You've made me feel a lot calmer about my decisions. And I hope you have, and I'm absolutely certain that anyone that's listening who had any doubts whatsoever about the headlines, the recent headlines, or any future headlines, will have feeling a lot more informed. So thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. I would say that sometimes people do have very emotional responses to talking about these sorts of things, and I'm very happy to talk to people about how they feel and all those kinds of things. But I think I'd appreciate kindness if people have found that difficult to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And the information that you share on social media is absolutely brilliant. And I always feel really confident when I read what you write. So if anyone wants to find out more about, what you do and, how to read what you write, where's the best place to go?
So I share all of my content on my Instagram page, which is @Sophie Dietitian, but I also do Facebook stuff, which is also Sophie Dietitian everywhere. And my website for business purposes is citydietitians.co.uk. And I do, because of the work I've done, I do quite a lot of working with vegans and plant-based people to make sure that their diet is nutritionally adequate and make sure they're not showing any signs and symptoms of deficiency. So I would be delighted to welcome anyone to clinic who does want to go through that process.
Brilliant. I will make sure that all the links are in the show notes. So if you're listening, you'll be able to find them. Just scroll down on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you can click the links that are directly below. So again, thanks, Sophie. That's been
lovely.
Amazing
to speak to you. Thanks very much.
I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. I feel like we've covered loads of really great information there, and I hope it has helped you to make a more informed decision around the headlines that you may have seen with regards to vegan, plant-based, vegetarian, processed meat, red meat, all of these kind of diets, and will allow you to make a more informed decision for yourself, and perhaps even see through some of the headlines in the future, because there are most certain to be more. So there we have it. All of the links that we've spoken about in today's episode are in the show notes, so depending on where you are listening, you will be able to scroll down on the device and just click on the links there. So thank you very much for joining me for another episode of the Ditch the Diet podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please make sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. Also got tons and tons of back episodes for you to listen to as well, if you're looking for something to do. And if you are a regular listener and you do enjoy the podcast, then please show some love and give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will take you 2 minutes to scroll down, hit the little 5 stars, and leave a little comment, because it really makes a difference. So thank you very much for listening again, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the podcast. Until then, enjoy the rest of your week.